I'm Jim Kircher. You might have missed it this past year. I did. The 35th anniversary of America's Superfund law. It gave the EPA the authority to manage the cleanup of the nation's worst hazardous sites. It was also a year that saw the beginning of a major Superfund cleanup in the heart of St. Louis. Now, that may have been overshadowed some by all the concern and coverage of the Westlake and Bridgeton landfills. But the old Carburetor plant on North Grand spent more than 2 decades on the Superfund list. Brenda Madden tells us why and what happens now.
It's not exactly a badge of honor to be named a U.S. EPA Superfund site, but for the North St. Louis neighborhood that surrounds this toxic eyesore, that unfortunate designation is finally paying off.
This was the Wilco building. They brought it all down to rubble.
In August, the EPA began the final demolition and cleanup of Carburetor, a 10-acre factory site that once employed up to 3,000 workers. From the 1930s to the early 80s, the plant produced carburetors for the auto industry until the fuel injection systems used in today's cars made them obsolete. But when the plant closed in 1984, it left behind a legacy of contamination. Asbestos, trichloroethylene, or TCEs, and polychlorinated biphenyls, better known as PCBs, a toxic man-made chemical compound that's been banned in the United States since 1979.
We became aware of the site after the building was shut down, when somebody else was in here dismantling transformers and spilling PCB oil out of transformers.
That was in the late 80s. In the early 90s, the EPA discovered that the hydraulic fluid used in the plant's die-cast machines also contained PCBs. Those buildings were demolished soon after under orders from the EPA, but the contamination remained.
So when you did your testing, what did you find?
We found that it was highly contaminated all the way down to bedrock throughout most of, if not all of, the die-cast area.
When PCBs were introduced as a product in the late 1920s, they were supposed to make industry safer.
PCBs were non-flammable, and you could mix them with oils and make the oils non-flammable, so you could eliminate the fire hazard. So it was a safe way of doing things.
But they also made workers sick. One of the early symptoms was a painful skin condition called chloracne. Prolonged exposure can cause cancer. PCBs also affect the body's immune, endocrine, nervous, and reproductive systems. And when PCBs are released into the environment, they stick around.
The persistence, I guess, comes from their chemical makeup. They just don't break down readily in the environment. And as a result of that, they can accumulate throughout the food chain. As the predators eat those lower order animals, it gets magnified in their bodies.
In the 70s, government researchers in Michigan began finding a correlation between levels of PCBs in breast milk and maternal consumption of contaminated fish. In 1976, Congress passed the Toxic Substance Control Act. That gave the EPA the power to regulate the manufacture and sale of chemicals, including PCBs.
It was all over the world. It was actually harming wildlife. It was showing up in animals throughout the food chain. And so here in the United States, it was banned for manufacture and use.
But banning PCBs and cleaning them up are very different endeavors. Carter became a Superfund site in 1993, but it's taken more than 20 years to reach this final cleanup stage. It will cost about $30 million. The EPA says it took more than a decade to negotiate payment agreements with Carter's former parent company, ACF Industries, and the other potentially responsible parties. The EPA also needed to make sure the neighborhood, including the Herbert Hoover Boys and Girls Club next door, had a say in the solution. For example, even though PCBs don't break down easily, they can be destroyed through an intense heating process. That was the EPA's preferred solution, but neighbors weren't comfortable with it. Instead, they'll destroy the remaining structures.
As you can see how they demolished that, they've got this big scissors thing up there, and he'll cut right through the concrete.
And excavate the site of the former die-casting buildings. The contaminated soil and building debris will go to a chemical waste landfill in Oklahoma. The non-contaminated debris will be crushed and reused to fill the excavation site.
There is going to be some residual contamination left in the excavation, and that will have like a 3-foot cap over top of that. So that'll have to be restricted, first of all. You can't dig in that area.
In the meantime, there are safeguards to prevent the spread of PCBs. Industrial-sized water misters keep the dust down, And before trucks leave the site, they go through an undercarriage wash so they don't drag contamination into the streets. There are also 5 air monitors, 4 at the site and 1 at the Boys and Girls Club.
We have to send that into a laboratory that analyze for PCBs to see if we find any PCBs in the air, and we haven't so far.
The EPA hopes to finish in late 2017, but Jeff Weatherford won't be here to see it. In a few months, he'll retire after overseeing this Superfund site for 12 years. But for this neighborhood, which has suffered significantly since the plant's closure, the beginning of the end of Carter Carburetor means the environmental justice that's eluded them for so long is finally here.
As a human being, it's very gratifying to see this thing finally come to fruition, because it has been a learning experience for me. From a public health standpoint, now you've got a property that was once contaminated, that was anybody that would get in the building could potentially be exposed to dangerous asbestos, maybe some TCE, certainly some PCBs. Now that's been alleviated and mitigated, and now this can be put back to good use.